I was already seated in the forward cabin when boarding continued, watching the aisle stay clear as overhead bins closed in sequence and the routine moved without friction. No one rushed. No one repeated themselves. And the crew followed the same checklist they always did when departure stayed on time. A woman entered alone. She carried a canvas tote on one shoulder and paused just inside the threshold. Not hesitating. Only reading the seat numbers before turning toward the front of the cabin. Her name would matter later. But at that moment, it did not register to anyone around her. Ava Brooks moved forward without drawing attention. She wore no jewelry, no visible brand, and her sneakers showed wear along the heel, the kind that comes from regular use rather than neglect. She did not scan the room for reactions. She walked as if the space had already accepted her. Near the entrance, a security guard stepped into her path, his hand drifting toward his belt as his body formed a barrier. He did not step in front of the man in a grey suit. Walking a pace behind her, deliveries are around the back. Ava stopped without reacting. She lifted her phone, turned the screen outward, and held it steady at chest height. The boarding pass filled the display. A QR code glowing beneath the flight number and seat assignment. I'm on the manifest. Flight 704 to London. Charter via Apex Aviation. The guard leaned in, squinted at the screen, then stepped aside. He did not apologize or explain. He simply moved out of the way. Inside, Ava chose a seat along the wall and set her tote at her feet, her posture upright as she waited. Across the lounge, the flight crew gathered near the counter. Captain Mark Reynolds stood with a coffee in hand, laughing louder than necessary, while Emily Carter stood beside him, holding the manifest tablet close to her body. Her eyes moved between the screen and the cabin door. The manifest shows seat 1A booked. Full fare. The concern was dismissed with a flick of the wrist. Ghost booking. Probably an assistant. Madison wants the window. Emily glanced down again, hesitated, then said nothing. Madison Clark entered, still speaking to her phone. Designer logos stacked across her outfit, and a rolling carry-on behind her. She nearly caught her foot on Ava's tote. Watch it. Ava inclined her head once. Sorry. Captain Reynolds straightened his tie as he moved toward Madison, pointing toward the aircraft. We have the Gulf Stream ready. Champagne is chilled. It better be. Madison replied. Last time it looked flat on camera. Ava glanced down at her boarding pass again. Seat 1 remained unchanged. When boarding was called, Madison and Captain Reynolds exited first, followed closely by Emily Carter. Ava followed several steps behind them, letting the distance hold. On the tarmac, the wind cut sharply as the jet waited with its stairs lowered. Emily stood at the door, tablet in hand. Welcome aboard, Miss Brooks. Her eyes flicked to the screen, then up again. Please, come in. The cabin interior was bright and quiet. Cream, leather, and polished wood, reflecting the overhead lights. Madison Clark was already settled into seat 1A. Shoes off, feet resting against the bulkhead. Phone held high. Ava stopped in the aisle beside the seat. Excuse me. No response. Excuse me. Sunglasses lowered slightly. Can I help you? Trash is that way. You're in my seat. Emily appeared at Ava's side. Miss Brooks, if I could show you to 4B. It's very comfortable. I booked 1A. Ava said evenly. I paid for 1A. Madison laughed and turned toward the cockpit. Mark, there's a person bothering me. The cockpit door opened, and Captain Reynolds stepped out, looking from Madison to Ava without checking the boarding pass being held inches away. What's the problem? She thinks that's her seat. He stepped closer. Ma'am, you need to move away from the VIP section. I have a boarding pass for this seat. He did not look at it. Seat assignments are flexible on my aircraft. The auxiliary power unit continued its steady hum outside. Ava stayed where she was. I'm not moving. The captain's jaw tightened. Take a seat in the back or get off the plane. I watched Emily's fingers tighten around the tablet, and Madison lift her phone again. Framing the aisle, Ava shifted her weight once. "I'd like you to check the manifest again." The captain turned toward the intercom. "Security to the stairs. Non-compliant passenger." Ava nodded, picked up her tote, and stepped back without protest. "Very well." As the door opened and cold air rushed in, she turned once. "If I get off, this plane doesn't leave the ground." The captain waved it away. "Get moving." She descended the stairs. The door closed behind her. Inside the cabin, the lights stayed on, and the engines did not start. I stayed in my seat after Ava Brooks stepped off the aircraft. The door closed. The cabin sealed. The lights remained on. Nothing moved forward. Captain Mark Reynolds stood in the aisle, not returning to the cockpit, as if waiting for the situation to resolve itself without further input. Madison Clark remained in seat 1A. Phone raised. Scrolling through comments as they appeared, Emily Carter moved back toward the galley. The tablet held close to her body. The engines did not start. From the cockpit, a voice carried back, asking for status. Captain Reynolds answered without turning, saying the issue had been handled and departure would follow shortly. The response was acknowledged. The aircraft remained stationary. Madison looked up from her screen. "Why aren't we moving?" Captain Reynolds glanced toward the cockpit door, then back at the cabin. "Minor delay. Sorting it out." Madison exhaled and shifted in her seat, her bare feet still resting against the bulkhead. "I have a shoot in London tomorrow morning. This shouldn't be happening." Emily Carter stepped forward, stopped, then stepped back again. She checked the tablet, then checked it a second time. Slower than before, her thumb hovered over the screen. Captain Reynolds noticed. "Anything new?" She shook her head. "Manifest still shows the same." He took the tablet from her hands and scanned it quickly. Then again. Slower. "That's wrong," he said. "I authorized the change." Emily Carter did not respond. She did not nod. She stayed where she was. Madison angled her phone toward the aisle. "We're delayed because someone didn't understand seating." No one replied. The cockpit door opened again. Captain Reynolds stepped out and lifted the intercom phone mounted near the jump seat. He listened, then spoke in short bursts, turning his body slightly away from the cabin. When he replaced the handset, his posture had changed. "Security is on the way," he said. "We'll be clear after removal." Madison smiled and leaned back. "Told you." I watched Emily Carter's hands. One finger pressed into the edge of the tablet. She adjusted her grip, then adjusted it again. The main door opened. Cold air moved through the cabin as two airport officers stepped inside. They did not hurry. They looked around, taking in the cabin before speaking. Captain Reynolds pointed toward the open door. "She's already off. Non-compliant passenger. I want her cleared from the area." One officer nodded and stepped back outside. Through the window, Ava Brooks stood at the bottom of the stairs, tote still on her shoulder. She was not speaking. She was not moving. An officer spoke to her. She listened. She nodded once. Madison raised her phone again. "Unreal." The officer returned to the doorway. "We're detaining her briefly to verify information." Captain Reynolds waved a hand. "Do what you need. We're losing our slot." The cockpit radio crackled. A voice requested confirmation of departure status. Captain Reynolds answered, holding to the same timeline he had given earlier. The engines remained silent. Emily Carter took one step toward the cockpit, then stopped. She looked at the tablet again, then toward the window. "Captain," she said quietly. "The tail number." He cut her off. "I know what aircraft this is." Outside, one of the officers took Ava Brooks's phone and held it longer than before. He turned the screen slightly, then spoke into his shoulder radio. Madison stopped mid-sentence. A patrol car rolled forward and stopped directly in front of the aircraft's nose. The distance was close enough to block a taxi. Madison sat upright. "What is that doing there?" Captain Reynolds stared forward through the cockpit glass. He keyed the microphone, then released it without speaking. Outside, the officer handed Ava Brooks her phone back. She did not look toward the cabin. She looked at the patrol car. The radio crackled again. Apex 704. Shut down and hold. Captain Reynolds remained in the aisle. No one moved. The cabin lights stayed on. The engines remained off. The aircraft did not move. I remained in my seat as the patrol car stayed parked in front of the nose, close enough that no taxi could begin without contact. The cabin stayed lit. The air conditioning continued at the same level. Captain Mark Reynolds finally returned to the cockpit. He closed the door behind him, then opened it again less than a minute later. His pace was different now. Slower. Measured. Madison Clark leaned forward in seat 1A. Mark. What is happening? No answer came back. Emily Carter stood near the galley, tablet still in her hands. She was not checking it anymore. She was holding it. Outside, one of the officers spoke again into his radio. He waited. Then he listened longer than before. When he finished, he looked toward Ava Brooks and nodded once. He turned and walked back up the stairs. Captain Reynolds met him at the doorway. The officer spoke quietly. Reynolds did not interrupt. He did not argue. He took a step back into the cabin without looking at anyone. The officer followed. Captain, the aircraft registration and ownership have been verified. The words landed without emphasis. Madison sat upright. Verified how? The officer looked past her. The registered owner of this aircraft is Ava Brooks. Effective as of 48 hours ago. No one spoke. Emily Carter's grip tightened on the tablet. She looked at Captain Reynolds. Then down at the floor. Madison laughed once. Sharp and brief. That's not funny. Captain Reynolds did not move. His eyes stayed forward. The officer continued. She is also the authorized signatory for Apex Aviation. That includes flight operations and crew assignment. Madison turned fully in her seat. So what does that mean? The officer shifted his weight. It means she decides who flies this aircraft. The cabin stayed quiet. Captain Reynolds swallowed and nodded once. Outside, Ava Brooks stepped onto the stairs again. She did not hurry. She did not look toward the cabin until she reached the top. She stepped inside. The change was immediate. Not emotional, but procedural. The officer stepped aside. Emily Carter straightened. Ava walked forward and stopped beside seat 1A. Madison looked up at her. You again. Ava did not respond to that. Miss Clark, she said, evenly. You are not listed on the manifest for this seat. Madison stood. Do you know who I am? Ava nodded once. Yes. Madison waited. You're a guest. And this flight is cancelled. Cancelled landed harder than raised voices would have. Captain Reynolds finally spoke. We can still make the slot. We just need... Ava turned toward him. Captain Reynolds, your authorization to operate this aircraft has been revoked. No volume. No pause. You will collect your belongings and leave the aircraft. Madison looked between them. You're firing him. Over a seat. Ava did not answer that. She looked at Emily Carter. Please escort Miss Clark off the aircraft. Emily hesitated, then nodded. Madison grabbed her bag. This is unbelievable. I'm calling my agent. Ava stepped aside. She did not watch her leave. When the cabin door closed again, only 4 people remained inside. Ava took a seat at A. She placed both hands on the armrests and sat upright. Captain Reynolds stood in the aisle. Miss Brooks. I didn't know. The manifest, said Miller. I assumed. Ava looked at him. You assumed based on convenience. She stood. You ignored the manifest. You invoked safety without basis. You called security to remove a paying customer from her assigned seat. She did not raise her voice. That is not a judgment issue. That is a procedure issue. Captain Reynolds nodded again. I'm not reporting this to the FAA. Ava said, but you will not fly for Apex Aviation again. He exhaled. Emily Carter looked up. Who will fly the aircraft? Ava turned toward the cockpit. First Officer, Lucas Reed. A moment passed. Lucas Reed appeared at the door. Yes. Ma'am, you'll take the right seat. Ava said. I'll take the left. Captain Reynolds looked up. You're rated. Ava reached into her tote and placed a leather wallet on the armrest. I am. No one argued. Captain Reynolds removed his badge and placed it beside the wallet. He picked up his bag and walked toward the door. The patrol car moved away from the nose of the aircraft. The engine started. From my seat, I watched Ava Brooks settle into the captain's chair. The checklist began again. We departed without ceremony. 48 hours later. The consequences settled without noise. Captain Mark Reynolds did not appear on another flight roster. His termination notice listed insubordination and breach of operational procedure. No press release followed. In private aviation, silence travels faster than headlines. Madison Clark posted once from the terminal. The video was deleted before the next boarding window. Brand partnerships paused, then ended, without explanation. First, Officer Lucas Reed was reassigned within the week. Right seat. Acting captain status pending review. The manifest reflected the change. Apex Aviation updated its crew protocol quietly. Seat assignments locked. Verbal overrides removed. I flew again a month later. Different crew. Same aircraft. The checklist was followed, line by line. Later, after landing, I thought about the moment she had been told to move, about how easily the system had accepted that instruction, about how long it took to correct it. My takeaway was simple. Most systems do not fail because of malice. They fail because no one stops them early.
The correction did not come with applause. It came when the checklist was followed by the person who should have been heard first. For more stories about quiet authority, broken procedure, and the moment a system is forced to correct itself, subscribe to Black CEO Tales. This story is fictional and was written with the assistance of AI. The characters, events, and settings were created for storytelling, education, and reflection. Any resemblance to real people or real events is purely coincidental.